Back on, here I am. Hello again, everyone. And before introducing today's speaker, just a couple of reminders again. If you could use your chat function, please, during the presentation and ask any questions of Nick. And then we can, of course, take them at the end of the presentation. And also, if you could have your mic muted. And I must add, it was very, very good today. No interruptions. Thank you for that. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Nick French. Nick was born in Harare, Zimbabwe, and studied science and business management at the University of Cape Town. He worked in various positions and eventually ended up working for an energy and petrochemicals company, Sasol Limited, which was headquartered in Johannesburg. In 1995, he was transferred to Singapore to take charge of Sasol's newly launched Asia Pacific Sales Office. He held a number of positions in general management, marketing, and risk management. During his 20-year career in Asia, he was intrigued how cross-cultural relationships in Asia impact business and became passionate about this topic. In 2011, he launched his own Singapore-based training company, Asian Ways, specializing in the field of cultural intelligence, developing meaningful and profitable business relationships between cultures around the globe. Nick is now enjoying a semi-retired life in PROBUS, Somerset West, not far from Cape Town, with his wife, Sylvia. He is the current chair of the PROBUS Association of Western Cape and the incoming president of PROBUS Council of South Africa. He is also a distinguished Toastmaster. He now focuses on research items of historical interest in presenting talks on these topics to various associations. And that's exactly what brings him to us today. So let's welcome Nick French, who will be speaking on the advent of open heart surgery. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you very much, Naki, and good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to address you today, and I'm going to be talking about the advent of open heart surgery and heart transplantation. I believe I've been given permission to share my screen. So hopefully you can see my screen. Can somebody just give me a thumbs up, please? Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Sunny. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to be talking about the advent of open heart surgery leading to heart transplantation. Now, as you heard during my introduction, there was nothing mentioned about my knowledge or involvement in medicine. And I am not a doctor. I have no medical qualification whatsoever. And you're probably all wondering how on earth did I get to be involved in preparing and presenting a presentation of this nature. Well, first of all, I studied science at university. That's me on the left. And just to show you that one day in one previous life, I did have hair. There it is. But I chickened out from doing medicine. I was actually quite fascinated by it, but I chickened out because it was a 6-year program, and I'd heard that the second year was really challenging, with anatomy and physiology. So I actually downgraded and studied chemistry instead. And that's where I landed up. And I had, as Naki mentioned, I had a career in the chemical environment for most of my life. So how on earth did I get round to presenting about heart transplantation? Somebody's got their, is not muted. Okay, let's carry on. So in 1969, sorry, somebody has their, hasn't muted because I'm getting my voice coming back at me. Is everyone muted? Okay, let's try that again. Okay, good, thank you. So anyway, what happened is in 1969, when I was, how old was I? About 16 years old, very influenced teenager. My mother gave me a copy of this book called One Life. And for those of you who do not know Christian Barnard, he was the very first surgeon who completed a successful heart transplant which took place in 1967. He subsequently wrote his very first book of 14, and it was in fact the most successful, called One Life. And my mother gave this copy of this book to me, and she said, you must keep this book and read it because it's going to cover some very famous events, and it's a first print, and it'll be worth a lot of money in the future. Well, I've still got the book, and it's probably worth less now than it was back in 1969. It's one of those books that you find in secondhand bookshops, selling for a few dollars. But anyway, this book fascinated me. The way it was written, it was a bit of like a romantic medical novel, but somehow it just tickled my interest. And from that point onwards, I always had a bit of an interest in what Chris Barnard was doing. And it was only 50 years later when another book on his life was published called Heartbreaker, which took a slightly different tack to his life and didn't paint him in such a positive way as he painted himself, which is understandable, I suppose. And at that stage, I'd been a member of PROBUS for about 3 years, and I'd been starting to do these talks. And I read this book on Chris Barnard again, along with a number of others, and I became fascinated about his life. He actually had a very, very interesting life. Not only was he a famous surgeon, he was very popular with celebrity ladies. He had a lot of very interesting relationships, and I actually do quite a good talk on Chris Barnard's women, for those of you who might be interested. And it shares his life through his medical career, but also describing a lot of the interesting premarital and extramural relationships that he had. So anyway, what happened is, as a result of all this, I decided to prepare this talk because Christian Barnard's life was integrated in the whole development of heart transplantation. And from that, I generated this talk, which I have the pleasure of presenting to you today. So let's have a little bit of fun here. I'm going to ask a question of you, and you're going to give me an answer in the chat box, for those of you that know how to use chat. When do you think the very first heart operation, not transplant, operation took place? What year do you think it occurred? So if you'd like to try your luck and type into the chat box, let's see what kind of answers we get, and then I'll share the answer with you. So I'm waiting to see some responses coming through. There's nothing, I'm not seeing anything yet. I don't know if I've got access. Oh, somebody said 1945. Someone said Roman times. Oh, that must have been interesting. No anesthetic in those days. Ow. Any other thoughts? Sure, you guys, are you falling asleep there? Okay, 1967. Interesting, okay. Any other ideas before I move on? Okay, obviously not too much. Okay, so let's carry on. So in actual fact, the very first procedure that's recorded, yeah, somebody's close there, Richard, well done, 1875, was actually in 1896, and it took place in Frankfurt, and it was undertaken by one Ludwig Rein, who was responsible for surgery at the City of Frankfurt Hospital. And one evening, a drunk who had been stabbed in the heart was brought in, and this poor chap was having difficulty breathing because of a buildup of blood in his pericardium, which is the sac that surrounds the heart. And he was having difficulty breathing. So Rein had no choice but to try and do something. So what he did is he made an incision through the pericardium, opened it up, drained off the blood, which immediately relieved the pressure, and found a 1.5 centimeter cut, which with the heart beating, he was able to stitch up with 3 stitches. And the patient lived. And he actually perfected this technique and did over 100 procedures in the next 10 years or so with greater success than if nothing was done. The mortality rate for this kind of affliction declined from 90% to 60% because of his technique. So he was really recognized as the first person who attempted any kind of operation on the heart. And in actual fact, there was nothing more really attempted over the years, because of the complexity of working with an organ that's continually moving and pumping and rolling in the chest cavity. But what happened is, towards the end of the Second World War, there was an American surgeon working in London called Dwight Harkin. And he noticed that there were a lot of soldiers coming in with shrapnel wounds and with shrapnel in their hearts. And he was able to very quickly open up the chest and reach in and extract the shrapnel and actually help the patient recover by removing that shrapnel. So he had a lot of success, and many of his patients continued to live to the rest of their lives. And he then went on to develop his technique to be able to treat something called a mitral stenosis, which is the narrowing of a valve between the chambers of the heart. And he developed that a few years later in 1948, again with considerable success. So this was the first real success of any note in closed heart surgery. But the problem was, how do you deal with open heart surgery? Up until then, closed heart surgery was basically not really opening up the chest cavity, disconnecting the heart, and then being able to work on it. That would have been open heart surgery. And this was the challenge that surgeons in those days faced. So what happened in terms of how this developed? Well, it actually originated mainly from the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. And there was a gentleman called Owen Wangenstein who headed up the Department of Surgery at this university. And it was really from here that most of the techniques and the technology that even we've had today arose. It came out of the University of Minnesota. And it's quite interesting that in those days, the University of Minnesota had a very interesting methodology, which in fact is something that's practiced today. And this was a picture I actually took from the museum, the Little Heart Museum they had there a couple of years ago. And you can see here that underlined, it says the medical school created an innovative atmosphere providing. And they were obviously focused on unique surgical techniques. And you can see here in this red box, it says mandatory, note mandatory, compulsory, informal weekly meetings that motivated residents to do path-breaking research. So this obviously created an environment for innovative thinking and for them to come up with new, fresh ideas on how to move forward. And I think this was largely one of the reasons that the University of Minnesota achieved such success in this area. Interestingly, companies like Google today have sessions like this where you're not bound to sit at a desk or sit around a table and discuss things. They encourage a very free thinking environment in a fresh, modern kind of lounge. So this is quite amazing when you think that this happened in the 1950s. Now, the person who is really responsible for the development of open heart surgery in the years down the line was a guy called C. Walton Lillehei. I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it. Now, he was a surgeon in the army who served in the Second World War in Europe. And he treated a lot of his patients who were wounded, not necessarily in the heart, but elsewhere, with a lot of compassion, and he was very efficient. And after the war, he eventually ended up at the University of Minnesota. Now, he had a bit of an unfortunate life. At the age of 31, he contracted cancer in the neck and had to have fairly radical surgery and radiotherapy, which left him with a bit of a crooked neck. As you can see here, it's quite obvious that he's had some kind of intervention. But he was, I would say, the father of open heart surgery as we know it today. And he was engaged in a lot of projects at the university, obviously focused on this challenge of open heart surgery. Because you see, in those days, one of the challenges was that, sorry, I'm just going to, here we go. Sorry, I had an animation that didn't come up. Was that unless you could do something with the heart and the body and stop the heart, you only, for a long period of time, you couldn't do very much because you only had a 3 to 4 minute window during which time the heart was offline before the brain stopped getting blood. And then you'd have brain damage. So literally they had to go in quickly, 3 to 4 minutes, do whatever could be done, which as you can appreciate wasn't very much. Sew the patient up and get them going again. So you only had this 3 to 4 minutes. And this was the major challenge in those days. And of course, the operating theater wasn't very sophisticated. You didn't have all these modern tools like blood pressure cuffs, automatic blood pressure readings. You didn't even sometimes have proper anesthetic. In fact, in 1953, My mother, when she gave birth to me, was anesthetized with ether. And that created a hazard environment in operating theatre because it was highly flammable. So they basically had simple tools. They only had glass thermometers in those days. They didn't have these electric thermometers that you can get. So of course it took a lot longer to do things. So it was also technology challenged in those days. So the thing is, how do you get to beyond 3 to 4 minutes? Well, one of the things they realized is that they could cool the whole patient down, reduce the metabolic activity. You could actually perhaps push that 3 to 4 minutes out to 10 to 14 minutes. So by refrigerating the body, by, for instance, having it on a mattress of ice cold water, or having it enclosed in coils through which ice cold water was circulated, or putting ice cold water into the stomach, which has a very rich blood supply, you could in fact extend that operating time. And Lillehay was one of the first surgeons to do this. He did a procedure on a 5-year-old patient who an hour later woke up, survived, and with a perfectly normal heart again. So this was one of the methodologies that they had available. Then the other problem was that some of the conditions that you had, particularly one of the common ones was the tetralogy of Fallot, which was a heart that had 4 defects in it. It had an underdeveloped lung artery, so the patient was always struggling to get oxygen. And a symptom of the tetralogy of Fallot was a blue face. You got blue babies. Maybe some of you've experienced that in your time. And there were other defects, like there would be the aorta was improperly located and a hole between pumping chambers and a thickened heart muscle. So this required a lot more intervention and took a lot more time. And the refrigeration technique was still a bit of a problem. It wasn't long enough, didn't give it long enough time to attend to all those defects. So Lillehay then tried another interesting technique, which used something called a vein called the azygos vein, or the azygos factor. And I'm not going to go into the technology of this, but all it entailed was hooking up another person next to the patient and connecting their blood supply to the patient on the operating table. So in other words, using the other patient's heart to circulate blood through the operating patient while their heart was offline and being attended to. Now, this, of course, was an exceptionally dangerous method because it meant that 2 lives were at stake, not just 1. And secondly, there were other issues. Now, when this procedure was first introduced, the thinking was to use prisoners as the donor patient. But the prisoners refused to have this done because they didn't want the patient's blood circulating back into their bodies. So in the end, Lillehay actually had to use dogs as donors, and he did so with considerable success. It's believed he did quite a few procedures using this particular technique with dogs and not humans. So because of that, they were able to do a lot more, and he was able to attend to the tetralogy of Fallot and use this method to get this done with some considerable success in the mid-50s. Now, of course, the Holy Grail was to be able to take the heart offline indefinitely and have something come in and replace the heart whilst it was being worked on. And I'm sure you've all heard of now the heart-lung machine. Well, the forerunner of this was something called a de Waal-Lillehay bubble oxygenator, which simply was a crude scientific device which took siphoned blood off the body, put it through a process where oxygen was, where the blood was exposed to oxygen, it was purged with oxygen, then debubbled, because you don't want bubbles going back into the human body, otherwise it would land up in the brain and kill the person, the patient, and then circulated back again. So this was Richard de Waal looking at his device, and this is actually a model of one of the original bubble oxygenators that can be seen in the museum at the University of Minnesota. In fact, I took this picture. It was amazing because it could be made for $15. It was disposable and it could be supplied in a sterilized package. Now, I'm not sure if I was a patient, I would like to have myself hitched up to something like this, but that's what it was like in those days. Now, the other thing that Lillehay did is he was responsible for coming up with the concept of a cardiac pacemaker. Some of you may be on pacemakers today. I've got quite a few friends are. Because he realized that once heart surgery had taken place, the heart, once it was back in place, was still struggling a little bit to get up to speed and get energy going again. And it needed some help. So he developed this external, of course, we now know that they're all mainly internal pacemakers that we have today, but he designed and developed this external cardiac pacemaker, which could be applied until the patient's heart got up to speed. And later on in the 60s, he was instrumental in developing all these prosthetic heart valves to replace defective heart valves. So as you can see, Lillehei basically provided us with so many techniques and equipment that have been developed to the extent that they're still in use today. And hence, he was the father of open heart surgery, which was amazing. But he was actually a lot more than that. He was also an educator. He trained over 150 heart surgeons who found themselves throughout the world, which I thought was amazing. And two of these actually were instrumental in contributing to the first heart transplant. The first was Vincent Gott, who was trained under Lillehei, and the other was, of course, my hero, Chris Barnard. Now, Chris Barnard was transferred across from Groote Schuur Hospital in South Africa. Groote Schuur means Great Barn in Afrikaans, in Cape Town, where he was studying to become a surgeon. He was transferred across to the University of Minnesota because they were looking for successful surgeons. So Owen Wangenstein here took Chris Barnard under his arm and brought him into the University of Minnesota. But Barnard was never involved in heart surgery at that stage. If you actually listen to my talk about Chris Barnard, you'll see he contributed to medicine in so many other ways. It was just that the heart transplant was the pinnacle of his career. He was working on something called intestinal atresia, which is something which happens when a fetus in a mother's womb is deprived of blood because of perhaps a restriction in a blood supply to the fetus. And the bowel isn't properly formed. It's got a constriction in it, which of course affects the survival rate of the baby when it's born. And he discovered how that happened. He did a lot of research and then came up with an idea as to how the survival rate of babies born with intestinal atresia could be, the survival rate could be improved dramatically to almost 100%. So that's what he was working on towards his Master of Surgery thesis when he went across to the University of Minnesota. But what happened is, one day he was wandering around the university, and Vincent Gott, who was already doing heart procedures in those days, and this is him here on the right, and remember he was also involved in the bubble oxygenator, invited Barnard to come and assist at a heart procedure. And Barnard was completely hooked by this. He was fascinated by heart surgery and decided this was what he was going to get into, which of course he did. And he did a lot more study at the University of Minnesota between 1955 and 1958 at the university. Now, what happened is, when was the first heart transplant actually take place? Everybody thinks it was Chris Barnard. It actually wasn't. It was done by an American surgeon called James Hardy, who tried to transplant the heart of a chimpanzee into a young man. And unfortunately, the transplant didn't take. The chimp's heart was just simply not strong enough to take over the workload that was required. So that was the first attempt, and nothing more happened after that. But what happened is, Barnard came back to Cape Town in 1958. And because he was such a promising young surgeon, the university gave him a grant for 3 years to do heart research back at Groote Schuur Hospital, and gave him a heart-lung machine, in other words, the bubble oxygenator, to bring back and do research. And he started doing research just on simple open heart surgery, because of course there's a lot of setting up of the surgical room and the aftercare and so on that one has to think about. So he got involved in doing all that. This was actually the research center that he worked in. And he had a team of assistants. And what happened is, he eventually decided to do a procedure on a human being. Up until then, he'd just been using dogs. So this particular assistant here, Victor Pick, his niece had a very straightforward heart defect. It would have been a simple procedure, and they decided to try the very first procedure. I think it was in the early 60s, eventually. Now, it should have only taken half an hour to an hour, but there were severe complications. It actually took 7.5 hours in the end. But the operation in the end was a success, and she carried on to live a long life. So that was the first step that Chris Barnard had to doing his own open heart procedure. Then what happened is he started getting into doing heart transplantation research. This was his holy grail. This is what he wanted to get involved in. So because of his experience in doing research on dogs, he proceeded to do transplantation research on dogs at that research center. And if any of you have the opportunity of coming to Cape Town, I strongly recommend you go to the Heart Transplant Museum at Groote Schuur. It's an amazing place. And this is one of the exhibits in one of the theaters that they have there. And this in the red circle here is part of the original oxygenator that they used to do the dog research back in the late 50s and early 60s. So Barnard did about, I think about 40 procedures to perfect his technique. Now, interestingly, a heart transplant is less complicated than a liver transplant and a kidney transplant that were already being done in those days. So it wasn't really a particularly difficult technique in many regards, but it was the aftercare that was what counted. So what happened is eventually in 1967, in December, Barnard conducted the world's first heart transplant. And of course, it was famous. It was the same year, I think, that the man landed on the moon. And many people equate the success of this with the success of putting a man on the moon for the first time. The patient was this man here. He was in his mid-50s, a guy called Louis Washkansky. He was a guy who lived life to the full. And when I say that, he enjoyed smoking and drinking and partying. And after so many years of punishing his body, he landed up with diabetes. And he actually only had a few days to live at the time that they did the transplant. The donor was a young lady in her early 20s called Denise Darval, who was killed, not killed, but severely brain damaged in a car accident, going to, in fact, buy a cake from a bakery across the road, and she was hit by a car on the way back. And they took her to Groote Schuur Hospital and established that she was more or less brain dead, although her heart was beating. She was a perfect match for Washkansky, and her father very generously agreed to allow her heart to be used in a transplant to Louis Washkansky. Again, in the Heart Transplant Museum at Groote Schuur Hospital, there's a model, a full-size, life-size model in a theater of the team operating. And this would have been, in those days, we're talking about 10 years later than the first development of the bubble oxygenator, this would have been the heart-lung machine that was used. As you can see, there are a couple of technicians here. So that was what made the first heart transplant possible. And there is Washkansky thanking Barnard in his ward for the procedure and giving him a longer life. And there was a lot of congratulatory telegrams and letters that were received. And again, you can see these at the museum. There was one here from Walton Lillehay, his mentor and his tutor. Dear Chris, congratulations to you and your team on a fantastic achievement, which I thought was very interesting to see. As you can see, here it was donated, in fact, dated the 4th of December, 1967, which was the day after Barnard started that procedure. Unfortunately, not everybody saw that the same way. There were a lot of people who felt otherwise. And there's another letter that's on record here from somebody in the US that says, "It is my profound conviction you are unmoral, a bunch of fools, all of you." And there were quite a few of those, actually. So quite interesting how people feel about things. I mean, just diverting a little bit, if you look at this whole issue of COVID vaccination, you know, I think most of us are quite keen on being vaccinated, but there are quite a lot of people out there who feel for one reason or other, excuse me, that it shouldn't happen. However, things went well for the first week. Washkansky was doing well. He was able to eat a meal. But after 7 days, things started going downhill. And the whole problem was that when you do a heart transplant, the body sees a foreign organ coming into it and wants to reject it. So you have to treat the patient with anti-rejection drugs, which at the same time lowers the body's resistance to infection, to bacteria. And unfortunately, after the first 7 days, there was a challenge as to whether they should treat for rejection or whether they should treat for infection. They couldn't do one or the other. And unfortunately, they didn't quite get the balance right. And after 17 days, sadly, Washkansky passed away. However, the surgical procedure itself was found to be tip-top. There was absolutely no complications, no problems with that. It was simply post-operation management that resulted in Washkansky's demise. So it was a true success from a surgical point of view. And Barnard had proved that it could be done. And what happened is this unleashed a flurry of surgeries from a lot of surgeons who'd been waiting in the wings, very famous surgeons, who realized that it could be done. So there were quite a few. There was a surgeon in New York called Adrian Kantrovitz, who 3 days later attempted a procedure. There were 2 other surgeons also trained alongside Barnard at the University of Minnesota, Richard Lauer and Norman Shumway. And in actual fact, Norman Shumway was quite jealous of Barnard and accused him of stealing some of his methods. Barnard recruited by saying, well, actually, all he used was some of the methods and the recommendations that Shumway had publicly published in the literature. But these were the initial pioneers who were really focusing on trying to get heart transplant going. So Kantrovitz tried on the 6th of December his first technique. I think the patient only lasted a few hours. He had 2 more attempts, both of which have failed, and after that decided to give up. But he was a staunch supporter of Chris Barnard. And then on the 2nd of January, so 1 month later, Barnard did his second heart transplant on a dentist called Philip Bleiberg. And Philip Bleiberg was also near death's door. His heart had virtually ceased to function. And he did another transplant. And Bleiberg was able to leave hospital after 6 weeks and survive for another 18 months before, sadly, he succumbed too. But he had a pretty good quality of life for another 1.5 years. So it's incredible to think that Barnard's second procedure gave or produced this level of success. Now, Shumway attempted his own first heart transplant on the 8th of January in 1968. So also roughly 1 month after Barnard's first attempt. And sadly, the patient died, I think, within a few days. Again, the reasons are not quite clear, probably because of the surgical technique wasn't quite perfected. I'll comment on that a bit later. Then Richard Lauer also attempted his first surgical procedure in May 1968. And unfortunately, again, the patient only lasted a few hours. And he, unfortunately, was the victim of a lawsuit from the patient's relatives. And because of that, he decided not to continue doing any more heart transplants or attempt any further. Now, it's quite interesting on the success rates within the first 6 months of heart transplant taking off. I mean, literally, once Barnard had proved that it could be done, a lot more surgeons were getting involved. But just looking at the success rate of Barnard, Shumway, Kantrovitz, and Richard Lauer, if you look at the bar here, this shows the length of time after the procedure for which the patient survived. So you have here Kantrovitz who survived, Washkansky who survived 17 days, Bleiberg that survived nearly 19 months. And then, unfortunately, all the others had very poor survival times after the surgery. So it just shows you how good Barnard was, because you needed that perfected surgery rather as opposed to maybe the post-management expertise. So Barnard has a distinction here of actually being photographed. This is Barnard on the right, with 5 of his surviving heart transplant patients, which I think is absolutely incredible. And by the way, Philip Bleiberg was the only man in the world to see his own heart for the first time that had been removed. Barnard was actually able to show him his diseased heart. So by April 6, 1969, so we're talking about 18 months later, there had been 133 transplants and 13 survivors, most of whom were Barnard's. There were now 64 teams in 22 countries. So it just shows you how this pioneering work just unleashed almost a tsunami of attempted heart transplants. Now, up until now, what was being attempted was what was called orthotopic heart transplants, where you remove the diseased heart and replace it with a healthy one. Barnard had one failure, and it was a very unfortunate failure. It was a friend of his son's who had to have a heart transplant. He was also very ill. And his son was watching the procedure from an observation point. And Barnard couldn't get the transplanted heart to start. And the patient actually died on the table. So Barnard's son said to him, "Dad, why did you have to take out the original heart? Why don't you just leave it in there and put in the donor heart to help the diseased heart?" And Barnard thought, "This is a good idea. I think I'm going to do this." So he did this, and it was incredibly successful. So this is called heterotopic heart transplants. And Barnard thereafter continued doing just heterotopic heart transplants with considerable success. Now, the unfortunate thing is that there were some administrative and legal issues around this whole business of heart transplantation. The biggest one was, of course, the definition of death of the donor. When was the donor deemed dead so that their heart could be removed? Was it when the brain was dead, or when the brain and heart was dead? And this was one of the primary problems that the American surgeons had, was that the law in America said that you could only remove the heart once the heart had stopped beating without assistance. Now, that was not great, because the minute the heart stopped beating, I beg your pardon, it meant that it was starting to deteriorate. And the longer you left it, the less healthy the heart was for the moment when it was to be transplanted. In South Africa, it was different. In South Africa, a neurologist could deem when the donor was dead, and that was by measuring brain death through no brain stimuli. The heart could still beat, but the brain was dead, which was meant that the surgeon could go in while the heart was still beating, remove it, and transplant it. Although actually in his first heart transplant, Barnard did wait until Denise Darval's heart stopped beating. Then the other problem we had in South Africa was this issue of apartheid. I think you all know what apartheid is. In those days, blacks and whites didn't mix. They weren't allowed to mix. There were separate hospitals for blacks, separate hospitals for whites. Black or colored nurses could not attend to white patients. So it was very, very restricted. And Barnard was a serious campaigner for integration of all races. And he was very successful at a time when there was a very conservative atmosphere in South Africa. He said, "I will not I will not work in wards where there aren't mixed color nurses and where patients of different color can mix." But the problem was, can you imagine how it would have felt if a white person had received say a black person's heart, or vice versa? So there were a lot of restrictions there, and initially they only kept the heart transplantation white on white, but later in time some mixing was allowed. And then the other thing that happened is, particularly in Barnard's case, there was a lot of jealousy. A lot of Barnard's colleagues were very jealous of his success, and they started not referring patients to him, so he couldn't get donors easily enough. So there was actually a bit of a lag in the availability of donors and for transplantations to be done in South Africa. However, the overriding factor of everything was this thing, rejection. The problem was that the transplanted heart could be rejected, and there weren't very good anti-rejection drugs available in those days. They were mainly steroids, and they weren't effective, and they lowered the body's resistance to infection. In fact, Washkansky died because he already had an infection from needles that had been put in his legs to drain his legs when he had diabetes, and there was some bacteria there and they didn't pick up on it. So the problem is rejection. And actually, if you look at Barnard's and probably some of the other surgeons' early transplants, here's some of the patients. You can see one lived for 23 years and died of a stroke. But with the exception of Washkansky, all the others died of rejection because there simply weren't good anti-rejection drugs available. But fortunately, in the early 80s, a researcher at the University of Belgium, Jean-Francois Borel, discovered a drug that became highly effective in managing rejection. It was called cyclosporine. And with heart transplantations and with treating patients with this, the survival rate, the 4-year survival rate increased from 42% to 80%. It was a massive leap forward. And the result is that heart transplants became almost a routine procedure by the start of the century. By 1985, there'd only been just under 2,500 done. In 2001, there was 100,000, and now, of course, heart transplants are done all over the world. So we owe this all to this gentleman at the University of Minnesota, C. Walton Lillehay, who had sadly passed away in 1999. He had a bit of a sad ending. He retired, I think it was when he was about 55, but he was held up for tax evasion, for having a lot of sordid affairs, and quite a sort of a decadent life in the end, which is kind of interesting. But actually all these successes, particularly the heart transplantation, we owe to him. And the Heart Institute at the University of Minnesota has been named after him, C. Walton Lillehay. And I've actually visited that about 3 years ago, because there's a little museum there in his honor. That's the entrance to it, where I actually took some of the pictures that I've used for this presentation. But it was quite incredible what this guy achieved, and I think it's quite remarkable. At the same time, if you haven't been to Cape Town yet, and one day when COVID permits, come and have a look at the museum at Groote Schuur Hospital. This is the entrance to the main section. There's vast portions of the wards and the surgical rooms are still there, set up as they were back in 1967. And there's a lot of artifacts, and you can get a guided tour around there. It's really amazing. Now, there's one other person I should thank for this presentation, and that's my dear mother, who, if she hadn't given me that book on One Life in 1969, who knows, I might never have ever got this interest in heart transplantation, Chris Barnard, and what happened in the world of heart transplant down the line. So I think we should just pay our respects to her. And there you have it. So that's me. That's my talk on open heart surgery. I hope you enjoyed it. I do offer a range of other talks in a lot of other subjects. If you go to my website, nickfrench.coza.co.za, you'll be able to see them there. If you'd like to contact me for any reason, that's my email, nrf5621@gmail.com. But I think I've probably overstayed my welcome. So thanks everyone for listening. And if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that very enlightening presentation. And also, I'd like to add, before we open up to the questions, my sincere apologies for the delay in getting you on. Normally, we are running pretty much on time. Anyway, here we are. Now, let's open up to the questions. I'm going to see if there is any. Well, actually, I don't see any question in the chat right now. So let's just give folks a couple of minutes here.
I'm wondering how many of our attendees have actually had any kind of heart surgery.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
It's an interesting one.
In the meantime, I'm just trying to do my best not to get there.
Yeah, me too.
Even though my diet is not quite consistent with that wish.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think we're all in that situation. But I just find it quite remarkable that little device, that first oxygenator that I saw at the university, that was actually used in surgery, because it looked just like a piece of chemical apparatus. Okay, so there's quite a few are, and yeah, cardiac bypass, yeah, is open heart. Somebody's asked that question. Somebody's had a stent. Yeah, of course, that's the next level, is how heart procedures can be done without going to open heart. You know, if you think about it, before stents were invented, one had to go in and do probably a vein graft, you know, or what do you call it, arterial graft. You needed open heart surgery for that. Now you can just shove something up through a cardiovascular system. So there we are. Yes, cardiac bypass is quite a big procedure.
Okay. Maybe you did such an excellent job that everything is clear like mud to everybody, and we don't have
I hope not. I was a bit clearer than that.
Anyway, just give them a couple of more minutes before we'll proceed with our closing remarks then.
Okay.
Yeah. What fascinating things can you tell us about South Africa in the meantime?
Going through tough times at the moment. We've the way the whole COVID situation is being managed is not that great. We've got a situation where I'd say if we're lucky, 5% of the population is fully vaccinated. We had an initial hiatus getting the whole vaccination thing going from a logistical point of view. We've now addressed that. We've got a lot of vaccine centers. Vaccine is available. But ironically, people are not stepping up to be vaccinated. They're not getting to be vaccinated. And I think some of it's the technology, you know, because you need to register on a database or get yourself to a center. Unfortunately, a lot of our population and our population is heading for 60 million now, is very poorly educated, you know, and don't have access to computers and phones. So we're struggling with that at the moment, and it's quite worrying. We've also got an additional problem that there's been quite a lot of violence in the country. You know, our former president, Jacob Zuma, was incarcerated. And there are quite a few of his supporters don't appreciate that and have been demonstrating, but it led to sort of out and out looting and destruction of property in two of our provinces. And I'm talking serious looting. I saw on the news today, they said that 1,300 ATMs, teller machines, were vandalized and money stolen from them. And 130 bank branches were basically routed. So there's some serious problems here at the moment. We're actually quite worried. Here in the Western Cape, in Cape Town, it's a different province with a very different structure, but all the same, it's still worrying. Mm-hmm. But other than that, weather's not too bad. We're in the middle of winter at the moment, but it's rained earlier today, but it's quite nice. Yeah. So, and I guess you guys must be having quite a good summer up there.
Yeah, heat-wise it is. A few rainy spots here and there, but
yeah.
It's been a pretty good summer.
Okay.
We had just one question. If I don't know if you took a peek at that, asking about the pig valves.
Yes. Yeah. No, there are other. Somebody's asked about other types of transplants. I mean, there's kidney, there's liver. I'm sure they can transplant just about anything. And by the way, as a matter of interest, one of the other transplants that was attempted back in the 60s, I think it was to transplant a head. A Russian surgeon transplanted the head of a dog onto another dog, and they both lived. And Barnard actually did that as well, and was able to demonstrate two dogs, you know, lapping up milk from a dish. So it's possible to do that. I'm sure there's others. There's corneal transplants that you can have in the eye. Again, I'm not a medical expert on these things, but yeah. So there you are. Interestingly, Chris Barnard did the very first kidney transplant in South Africa as well, first successful one. He decided that to practice or to learn the whole procedure and patient aftercare in heart transplantation to do a kidney transplant, which he did, and the patient lived perfectly. The pig valves, I don't know much about that. I do know that they were used and that in the early days, very rudimentary valves were made from pig tissue that was sewn onto a ring to make call it a transplantable valve. So yeah, that was also something. No question, it was a great talk. Thank you. When did Barnard die? Barnard died in 2003. He was 78 years old. He got involved in some fairly dubious deals after he retired in 1983, some of which didn't do him justice. But he set up a heart foundation, actually in conjunction with Princess Diana before she was killed. And he ended up traveling to Cyprus, and he was in a place called Pathos. And he was asthmatic at the time. He was by the swimming pool and he had an asthmatic attack, and he left his puffer behind in the room, and he actually passed away by the swimming pool, age 78 in 2003, which was a huge loss.
Okay, so one question.
Naki, it's Dick here. I'd like to say a few words. Nick, thank you very much for doing this very informative, very interesting presentation. Nick, I want to add, is a very busy individual. He not only doing presentations with a number of different groups around the world, but recently he just became the head of the PROBUS Council in South Africa. That's similar to our president of our PROBUS in Canada. So congratulations, Nick, on that position. And also, from a PROBUS global standpoint, it's interesting to look at our attendees today. We have attendees from around the world, and that's a lot to say about the context of the presentation today. Thank you very much.
Okay. Richard, if I might just say something, again, thank you for involving me in PROBUS Global. I'm not sure if I think you do know about this, but following the talk on the Battle of, I think you might have attended it. There was a talk given by Chris Lewworthy on the Battle of Britain to you guys. I think it was, right?
Correct.
And we engaged as council. The very first thing we did was engage Chris to give a talk to those people who could access Zoom around South Africa from PROBUS. So we promoted Chris's talk. We had 140 people register. Actually, only 100 turned up on the day. In fact, we had so many, we had to split Chris's talk into 2 sessions. He did the talk, and then 2 hours later, he repeated it to a different audience. And it went down very well. And this is something I want to promote here. I'd like to have a quarterly international speaker through PROBUS for our group. So thank you for laying the groundwork for that to happen.
Thank you.
All right, Nick, I just have one more comment here from Ron. It came directly to me, so you wouldn't have seen it. They do appreciate very much that you recognize your mom in your presentation. So actually, I was thinking of that too. So that's really nice to see. And also the gentleman does add your association with the Toastmasters and how it was very evident in your presentation. That means you did a fantastic job. So
thank you, guys.
Thank you so much very much.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. And now I will invite Dave for his closing remarks.
Okay, thanks very much, Naki. Nick, very interesting background. Coming into this, I did not think I thought I knew about Bernard, but obviously I did not. It's very interesting, the people at the University of Minnesota, how instrumental they were and everything that led up to this. Obviously, it didn't come out of nowhere. And I'd be interested to know about his life from your other talk that you mentioned. So again, thanks from everybody for this presentation, and we look forward to our future connections to the PROBUS Club in South Africa.